A very warm welcome to you all this afternoon to the Wheeler. My name's Doug Hall. I've been designated moderator of this afternoon's session, and just a brief snapshot. In a former life I was the director of the Queensland Art Gallery and Gallery of Modern Art, and initiated the idea and nearly died through to its fruition. I also initiated the Asia Pacific Triennial, and since returning to civilization, my hometown Melbourne, I was commissioner for a couple of Venice Biennales, and I'm now a fellow at the Australian Institute of Art History at Melbourne University. But delighted to be moderating and chairing this session on a subject which is very dear to me, and so it's a great Sunday afternoon when Collingwood has a bye. At the outset, I'd like to thank the Wheeler Centre. Its reputation, of course, is legendary. Various supporters, the great AsiaLink, Arts Victoria, and the Arts Centre of Melbourne. I know there are many keen observers here today, including people from DFAT and I think the Australia Council as well, and representing other institutions and arts organisations. So it's a great welcome. I have the chance to offer a preamble, which I'm pleased to do, and if I seem a little gratuitously provocative, it's because I think it's necessary, and we should also understand that what I'm talking about is Australia in its context. I should say that while I've been talking, each of the panel members will be introduced individually so that A, you don't forget who they are, and secondly, when they've spoken, you certainly won't forget who they are. They're very distinguished observers of the arts in Asia in their particular disciplines and fields, and I will introduce them individually as the afternoon proceeds. But when we think of soft diplomacy, we often think of government and its attempts to provide a fuller account of who we are without the brushness of commercial self-interest. But it seems relevant to ask soft diplomacy for whom and for what purpose. If we think about the white paper Australia in the Asia Century in 1912 and look at the Prime Minister's Preamble, she spoke of Australia's rise, the economic powerhouse, and then went on to talk about that there are great social and cultural benefits to be had from broadening and deepening our people-to-people links across the region. The arts and culture reappear on page 269, after football diplomacy and before media, and the appendices begin on page 273. I'm not arguing that the information that's contained in that is not valuable, but I think we also need to place things in its context. Immediately after I'd read the Asia White Paper, I reread Michael Wesley's brilliant book, which I'm sure most of you have, There Goes the Neighbourhood, Australia and the Rise of Asia, published in 2011, one of the most brilliant accounts of geopolitical understanding of the Australia-Asia condition in the last decade or more. Now, while perfunctory and generic expressions dealing with the arts and other people-to-people relationships are welcome, they often seem to be expressed in a manner which assumes nothing ever pre-existed Australia's newly expressed urgent self-interest. It is often accompanied with jingoistic nationalism and, dare I say, a touch of vainglory. I wonder what our neighbours might think if they were to ever read such documents. Glorious, rich cultures with proud histories are now represented as heavily populated, geographically close fodder for our economic future, perhaps our survival. And I suspect we forget that others may not see us as we see ourselves. We should know that national introspection is not our strong point. Many of these policy documents talk of the need for an Australia literate Australia, yet they are expressed in a manner which fails to acknowledge cultural richness in any former and continuing relationships. And I'm always reminded that in 1896 in Townsville, Australia's first Asian diplomatic representation took place with the establishment of the Japanese consulate. My point is that government policy lags behind the conduct and brilliant work of others. Think of AsiaLink, the Asia-Pacific Triennial, artists, writers, institutions, universities, and other brilliant individuals. It seems policy is being shaped in the wake of important groundwork. This often happens in spite of policy imperatives, not because of them. That's not necessarily a bad thing, especially if they provide the money to others, as governments subcontract policy and its application to those who know what they're doing. But the expression of cultural value is as unimaginative as it is dull. No doubt people will be able to quickly cite many and varied examples of long-term support, large amounts of money handed out from governments for successful projects in Australia and vice versa. But that's not my point. Think what $100 million means to the federal budget, and think what it might achieve in giving expression to our belief that Asia is our future. It's a no-brainer, and it won't happen. We also need to be in a state of perpetual reality check. No one has ever doubted Australia's heightened sense of self-esteem. So what happens when excellent artists and companies receive little or no interest in Asia? Serious introspection is important. What if some of our work fails to connect outside Australia? We need to recognise we are not the only Western democracy seeking a timely, and in Australia's case, urgent involvement and engagement with the wider region. One Japanese museum director said to me when I asked if he was interested in historical Australian art as part of our exchange, his reply was disarming at the time, but now completely understandable. Not really. We can get culturally specific derivative Western art from just about anywhere at any time. He wasn't being rude, he was just explaining. Cultural diplomacy is an act of reciprocity. It must be. Here we have some speakers who are far too polite to talk about Australia in the manner I have, and with any luck might have a different view and a more generous view of Australia. But I'm sure that we will find great insights into how they deal with their domestic cultures and its presence internationally and the wonderful complexities that it represents. And so it's now my pleasure to introduce our first speaker on my left, Parmesh Shahani, jet lagged from India last night, and it's a very warm welcome to you. I think to be listed in 2012 as one of 25 Indians to watch out for by the Financial Times in India is fabulous. Out of a population of a billion, one of 25 is quite an accomplishment. As you have read, he is the head of the Godrej India Culture Lab, an experimental idea space across a variety of art forms, and working with academic, industry, community, artistic, domestically and international relationships, and it's a great delight to have him here. He's particularly interested in Indian audiences and the world, and I talked about that reciprocity that takes place of how we view ourselves, how others might view us, and how we might develop relationships as a result of that. And Parmesh, it's a pleasure to invite you to speak.
Thank you. Very happy to be here. Also very happy to see my friends from Twitter in the audience. Hello. Welcome. So we've been tweeting about this for the past few days, despite the jet lag. So it's good. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about that more generous view towards Australia in a bit. But before that, I just want to tell you a little bit about what the lab is and what we do and why this particular topic is so interesting to me. And then I'll further Doug's provocations, and maybe, we can have a really meaningful conversation later. So the Culture Lab that I run is not really a diplomacy initiative. It's an experimental space, but we do a lot of interesting work around soft power. And to me, what we're trying to build is a unique model on how future institutions can be built at the margins, because we're an in-between space. But to me, that's the thing. This idea of institution building with the capital I and this capital B, to me, is over. I think the new kind of institutions have to be at the margins, and they have to be hyphenated in between spaces. And that's something that we're trying to build with the lab. It's an experimental sandbox that operates out of a company. So it's a unique kind of zone that's corporate funded. But it's a space where we cross-pollinate the best ideas in India and around the world on what it means to be modern and Indian. Even though we sit inside a company, which in this case is Godrej Industries, one of India's largest companies, it's arm's length in terms of the activities we do. So, our curation and our independence is completely separate from that of the company. We're three things. We're very fluid. So we're format agnostic. We, in terms of both what we do and how we do it. So we could do conferences around what it means to be urban. We could do performances on a range of, art forms. We could do factory pop-ups. Some of the things that we do is we take these 200,000 square feet giant factories and fill them up with magic, crazy stuff, whether it's giant robots walking around, whether it's 3D printers spewing out stuff, whether it's fashion shows, whether it's artists painting on walls, whether it's all these crazy things. Sometimes then we destroy these spaces the morning after we've created them. So it's that kind of stuff. So it's that as well, but it's also, it could be academic conferences and other more mainstream kind of events. So we're not defined by our format. We're more defined by our mission and what we do. What we are is we're very collaborative. So we are a sense of, the reason why we exist is to reach out and build these links and really cross-pollinate the best ideas across academia, business, design, performance, government, the non-profit space, as well as individuals. And the third thing that we do is we're open source. Everything that we create is put up on the website and serves as a resource for the world. I think this age of people holding stuff close is over. Really, the world is about platformication. And if everything that we do cannot be put out in the world for something else to use, then it's really silly. Institutions like MIT are doing this as well. They're recording the courses and putting it up out there. I think there's no reason why individuals or corporations or or non-profit spaces, certainly the government, should do otherwise, right? Now the lab is just one example of an very exciting ecosystem of ideas that's coming out of India. That most people in the world don't know of. Certainly I don't think here, because I think when you think of India, you think of curry or you think of Bollywood. And I don't think, and I think I agree with Doug in that, when the Australian government or others have made efforts, I think they reach out to the most mainstream and to the most typical. On the other hand, there are hacker spaces, there are maker festivals, there's indie music, there are pop-up buildings, thinking of sustainability in a very interesting way. There's all kind of citizen media experiments that work both in urban and rural India. There's this other kind of institution building which is happening, which is not formal institution building, which is not government-led or to a large extent corporate influenced. And I think this is something which is really changing the face of modern India. This is something that we at the lab exist to try and, we try and connect the dots between these spaces and between these spaces in the world. So I think you should really, when you reach out, if you're interested in India or interested in any other countries for that matter, don't look at the mainstream, look at the margins, look at the vanguard, and look at all the interesting experiments that are happening there. What you might realize is that the vanguard and the margins are connected to each other already. We live in a world where media and migration have made questions like what is global and what is local actually at one level unimportant, but on the other level really, really important. And if you look at the margins, you'll find that these conversations are already happening there. There was this interesting article by Matthew Bishop of The Economist where he spoke about how these boundaries are dissolving in this world, how earlier governments, corporations, the non-profit world, citizens all had their roles very clearly defined, but now instead we live in a world where roles between who is who and who does what are blurring. So now the way the world works is there are challenges and you gather up a posse of people that you think might meet these challenges. And there's interesting examples in this. If you look at Bill Gates and how he's trying to solve toilets, for example, we haven't designed a better toilet for like several decades, and like maybe we should design a better toilet. He's not talking government to government or university to university. He's saying, I'm doing a toilet challenge, everyone come together. In this kind of world, I think we need to ask questions, especially in Australia, how can we contribute to this world where the world will be about coalitions of people really coming together to solve challenges, to ask themselves these questions about identity. And I have a few things that I think Australia can do in this regard, and I'll suggest these, and then I'm really excited to chat with all the other panelists and with you all about these. The first is, I think, what Australia can really do is to collaborate with non-state actors. For so far, it's been state to state, and I think that's good, and it's paid off maybe some dividends, but we're really missing out on a lot of the action that is happening, especially the forward-thinking, future-oriented action that is happening. For example, and a lot of the non-state actors don't necessarily operate in diplomacy, hard or soft. They might operate, if you're creating a hacker space in Beirut, or if you're doing a pop-up event in a factory in Bombay, you're not really thinking of cultural diplomacy. You're just thinking of doing cool stuff and having a good time. And when that happens, the world kind of flows in automatically. So at the Culture Lab, for example, I was telling Rei, we've had collaborative events with Tadao Ando, the famous Japanese architect, Kenya Hara, who's the chief designer of Muji. And these are things where we brought Kenya Hara, and we did this event. And at some point, the Japan Foundation, etc., they said, can we be part of it? Likewise for this. So we've also been doing things where a lot of countries get involved, but they get involved after we've already done this organic collaboration, and I think that's good. A lot of the stuff so when you collaborate with non-state actors, it's, people just flow across and collaborate across different based on the ideas rather than, where they are from. So I think that's very, very good. I think what Australia can also do, and we've not just done that with individuals, we've often collaborated with universities like Stanford, or with conferences like INC, which is the India version of TED, and so on. So if I look back, a lot of what we do organically is about diplomacy, but it never felt that way, and it certainly doesn't feel that way. It just happens organically, and collaborating with non-state actors gives you a chance to do that, also to really remain on the cutting edge and on the vanguard of the change that is going to happen. The second thing that Australia can do really well is to really, and it's something that Australia is good at and is known for, is to be on the edge, to create new knowledge and innovation ecosystems, using the work that's been done already in Australia as an exemplar, and then really having that conversation about it itself with other parts of the world. You were critical, and I think you were very... I think there are some things that Australia does that it should talk more about in terms of what it does, that it doesn't, in terms of what things that it does well. Just for example, Australia has a great record on LBGT rights. People like Justice Kirby, etc., are really respected in India because the LBGT movement in India looks at the changes that have come from here. I think it would be very interesting, perhaps, if all the money that Australia spends on trying to woo Bollywood, if you could even give, maybe a bit of that towards interesting conversation on LBGT rights in places like India. It might actually do more for diplomacy and more for improving, even at a governmental level, improving the image of Australia and other parts of the world as a space for free ideas, as a place for liberal thinking, and so on. Or for example, for new kinds of knowledge creation or whatever. I mean, there's so many things that Australia is good at, but I think investing in platforms as opposed to investing in things, and Cait, she created one with Ozzfest, and I think that could go on as a very interesting cultural platform. And there's so many more that I think we could think. And the last thing that I think Australia could, and it's already doing, although it's doing it organically and not really systematically, is really tapping into global ambassadors. For example, Gary and George from MasterChef. I don't know if you all have any idea how popular they are in India. In fact, in 2009, the image of Australia was really, really, people in India looked at Australia really, really badly because there were a whole bunch of race-related incidents in Australia. And of course, in the age of the internet and cell phones and national television, it spread. In fact, I think it was on the nightly news in India for a month. I think in Australia, maybe it came maybe once or twice. But these were huge issues in India. And they had ramifications in terms of the number of students that came from India to Australia. They dropped in tourism and so many other things. I think Gary and George have done more to quell that than any official efforts of the Australian government or the tourism department in terms of just, MasterChef Australia is so popular. Whenever they visit, they're mobbed. And I think Australia's image has improved. Now, really, appointing Gary and George as global ambassadors, I think, would be a great thing. But really tapping into stuff that you all have as resources that are good at, but that can be used more strategically, I think would be good. I'm going to stop at this, but I'm really looking forward to the conversation afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you, Parmesh. And a good closing comment to stop on, the nation saved by MasterChef.
He spoiled my punchline. That was what I was going to tell you about.
That's very good. We're working our way back, I think, in order of density of jet lag. Katelijn, welcome.
Thank you.
Based in Singapore, but here via Sydney for a while. Katelijn Verstraete is currently the Regional Director of Arts and Creative Industries at the British Council in East Asia, and before this she was Deputy Director, Cultural Exchange at the Asia-Europe Foundation. Today she's going to address some of the issues, I guess, at the more formal level of cultural diplomacy and public diplomacy and in the region, and particularly about how you define such a vast disparateness of Asia within the British Council's remit and agency within the region. I know many of us look to the British Council with envy. We look at it often as an exemplar of how to conduct soft diplomacy, because it does so with skill, intelligence, deftness, and dare I say, without the berating sledgehammer that Australia is often prone to invoke. So we look forward to your counsel.
Thank you. Well, it was interesting to see, the title of soft power. I actually don't really like those two words, soft, and especially the word power. I think it's much more about engagement, and obviously it means it's a space where not just the government, non-state actors, hybrid organizations like the British Council are part of, but in the end it is about even how people, how do you project yourself in dealing with somebody else, and obviously you want to bring the best of yourself in it, but it's about relations, so it's definitely about mutuality. What's interesting is that the whole, I think, for us also, for the British Council, has been adapting itself quite a bit over the last 80 years, is how, obviously, in an Asian context, things are changing. The geopolitical changes globally, it's the West and the rest, the rest is really important, but also the function of a government. I was just saying it already, how maybe the government is often following what's happening organically and taking up and amplifying it. And it's interesting to see that if you see, the monocle, when they do this soft power index thing. In 2012, the UK was #1, and actually that had a lot to do with the Olympics. I think the creative approach, from Danny Boyle towards, projecting, I would say, an image through real, authentic way of how, the British, I would say, creativity at work. Yet I was really surprised in the top 10 not to see Korea. Because I have the impression that kind of popular culture is not taking as much into account of the soft power index. While we all know that, what was it recently when I was in Sydney last week on Culture, Technology, Entrepreneurship Remix Conference, we talked actually quite a bit about, Korea too, how, Korean pop and drama is much more, listened to even outside of Asia. So it's really interesting how pop culture is often not really, that much part of it. So how does the British Council, between, let's say, the state and the civil society, work in that hybrid space? Because we are supported for 20% only by the government. So we are at arm's length from the government. Yet, obviously, we have accountability to the government. So it's in that space that we, as an entrepreneurial public service, that's how we call ourselves, because we have to generate our own income for quite a bit. How do we actually work around that without losing actually our focus of culture relations and building trust and understanding between people? It's all about, I would say, that multilaterality around it. We are not an organization only working on bilateral, but actually looking what are the issues at stake, and how could the UK give an answer to that? What is a unique added value of the UK and the British Council within that to deal with those issues? Now, if you look at Asia, looking at it, we've worked, I would say, for a long time, much more on a bilateral way, Singapore, UK, Australia, UK. But looking at the changes that are going on, for example, you know, the ASEAN community building up, the discussions in North Asia, you know, the kind of, you know, connections that are much stronger now between China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. How do we as an organization deal with that? And how do we actually look at what artists are doing, you know, and working within that, I would say, that energy around that. So we do it in two ways, basically. We are looking at, on the one hand, of strengthening the sector itself, because we believe that if you actually strengthen the sector, you know, of the country you're working in, it will be beneficial for both, you know. If we work, for example, in Indonesia on an MOU between the government and the Ministry of Tourism and Creative Industries on creative industries build-up, you know, for us, that's important because it gives opportunities later on for people to work together. If we look at policy development on creative industries in Vietnam, obviously it's looking not just from the UK-Vietnam perspective, but actually also Vietnam is very much looking at Korea. So we're actually bringing that conversation about, you know, different models within the discussion and looking at it, I would say, at a higher level in terms of what, you know, what people's concerns are, both in the social, cultural, economic, political realm. You know, we do it in the culture sector, but also how the culture sector would connect with the social issues, the big global concerns. We actually launched just last week a new program. It's called Elevate, and where we are looking at the really creative, bright sparks, you know, the real social and cultural innovators who want to make a positive, you know, social change. And how do we work around that? So we want to work that, you know, bring that open and involve people both from Australia, New Zealand, Indonesia, Japan, the UK, and look around those issues. You know, looking actually higher than just what is the particular only concern of the UK. So it's looking at opportunities where we bring together people, often in a multilateral setting, to look at particular areas where we think it's important to work at. But interesting enough, you know, what we perceive more and more is it's not just about what the British Council and what the UK expertise and artists, you know, how they work together abroad, but actually it's more also about how it comes back to the UK. Because if you look at countries like Southeast Asia, actually, you know, common people in the UK wouldn't really know what Vietnam contemporary art is about, or what, you know, Indonesia is about. So it's about, our role is also to make that flow of information, you know, going in a lot of directions. And we use the digital. I think that's something we're starting to learn quite well. If we set up a British Council collection exhibition called Private Utopia in Japan, we actually, you know, did a Twitter tour about the exhibition, and we reached more than 350,000 people, you know, who actually, you know, were connected to that tour and would know more about, you know, British art through that means. So we are exploring different ways of engagement and different ways of looking at each other. And that includes not just the arts, but it's also the creative industries. What people would say, why is the British Council particularly connected to creative industries? I guess it's also the way how we formulate internally what creative industries or economy means. For us, it really means the softer side of the creative economy, which is about, you know, stimulating leadership in the creative economy, looking at what are the real innovators, you know, the people who are really making a change, looking at new models of operation. How do creative entrepreneurs actually, in a situation where state funding is, you know, getting lower and lower, how do they actually create a model that is sustainable and that still holds very strongly on their cultural values? So that's of interest to us, because it's of interest to the people in the UK, and we can see there's so much happening in East Asia around that we just have to be in that space and to make these discussions happening. So, I mean, we are doing that, for example, by bringing creative entrepreneurs together in Hanoi in October and looking at the last 10 years, right? We did a whole program on creative entrepreneurship. What did we learn? And how is that space changing? You know, there's a lot of maker spaces you were talking about that. How do we interact with that? Because that's actually what people in the UK are really interested in. And they know that things in Asia are happening very differently and in very innovative ways because it's a different context. And that's exactly what we want to do, to create those conversations and those opportunities between the people. So, you know, it's kind of touching on a lot of different areas where we want to take advantage of working in a regional way, because we believe that this is the way how artists are working. They don't always look particularly at, you know, where people are coming from in terms of countries, but they concentrated on ideas and on issues that are really, really important. So obviously, I mean, we are an organization that exists for this year 80 years, and it has grown out of a very, historic context. And it's, I would say, the model of the British Council is a fairly expensive model. At the same time, you would say, with the investment that the government does in only 20% of our, 700 million pounds turnover, it's actually fairly small for the amount of benefits, I would say, it gets in reaching, really a lot of people across the globe. So I would say it's a good investment to work on, and it actually creates a real understanding, because we have people on the spot in every, the 110 countries. So obviously that intelligence that is gathered on the spot is just worth gold, because it's those people, who are local people, together with, people from the UK, from other countries, who really make those translations. And that's what you see when people say, oh, why do we need still the British Council? We can do it directly ourselves. Yes, a lot of big organizations in the UK, like VNA, would not necessarily, need us. But there are smaller organizations who don't have that international capacity, who would come to us and say, how do I approach this in Japan? Or how do I actually know that the people I'm working with, that they have, that I can trust them? So that's the information, the intelligence that we can bring about, which, is something that you cannot completely put into 100% into digital. I think the digital tools are helping, and that's what we are wanting to do in China, setting up a digital platform, where that collaboration also happens on a digital level, together with the information exchange, and where we keep the dialogue going on basically at different levels. So, I mean, for Australia, to link it back to here, I think it's a very different situation, because you don't have a British Council kind of model as such. And I think the world is also changing in terms of different type of initiatives. I must say, I'm very interested in seeing models like the Australia Council of the Arts has used in working and having one person who is supported by the government but works in IETM, the International Network of Contemporary Performing Arts, and has created in Brussels and has created stronger connections on the European level for contemporary performing artists. So I think that's an interesting and a very clever model to look at, which I have not seen replicated, a lot yet. But I think it's interesting how government and networks, culture networks, because I really believe in the power of those networks, are connecting with each other. And it's about amplifying it. It's about looking at who in the space of the of that cultural diplomacy, of that international culture exchange, has actually to offer what exactly, So I would say, if I see what the work that AsiaLink is doing, that's what I'm most familiar with, because it's also most clear in my, undertakings in East Asia. I think it's an amazing, platform. And that doesn't mean that AsiaLink has offices all over Asia, but it connects with real important partners in the region. So there's different ways of engagement that we need to look at. But one thing, I guess, it's all about coordination. It's about connecting it together and have a real good conversation of what, in the end, you really want to achieve, and for who you want to achieve it, I guess.
Thank you. Before the day is out, we'll get you to write down the figure you mentioned, the budget 100 times for distribution. And I think your qualification was that it's modest. Thanks, Katelijn, very much. Cait Ben-Tovim is our next speaker, and Cait was the person who asked me to moderate this session, which I was happy to do. She's with the Arts Centre in Melbourne, and previously, in those very formative years, not that long ago, was named a Sydney My Creative Fellow, but has been a creative producer for Oz India, and is particularly interested to talk about the lessons that have been learned from that. She's keenly interested in the idea of cultural and soft diplomacy, and the extent to which we do or do not take it seriously, particularly in diplomatic contexts, or is it just seen as an exercise for ribbon cutting? Kate,
Thanks.
over to you.
Thanks so much. It's fantastic to be on this panel with such great guests. I thought this was, in the Australian context, a topical time to be having this discussion. Not actually talking about the recent news with Australia Network. I think I'm actually more talking about that surreal sight last night of Jessica Mauboy standing next to an astronaut holding the Aboriginal flag on Eurovision Song Contest. I don't know if people saw that. I still can't decide if that was a kind of an epic triumph or failure of soft power, but certainly in the media, and I think that's great. So my interest is really, I guess, in the intersection of arts and soft power in the area I guess we would call cultural diplomacy. My background is in the arts sector very much, not as a diplomat, and from that perspective I think in Australia there's a little bit of a policy vacuum in these areas, considering we don't have an overseas cultural body that looks at this, and I think artists and particularly in the small to medium arts sector have been trailblazing and doing this work in the region and what we would define as cultural diplomacy for a really long time, but it doesn't always, I guess, trickle through to the major policy areas and isn't necessarily always supported. But I'm going to actually talk through a small example of where I think the government got it right. Sorry, Doug. I was based for 20 months, maybe they call it embedded, in the Australian High Commission in New Delhi. And I was actually contracted to the Australian High Commission to produce something alongside the very skilled diplomatic staff called Ozzfest India. So this was one of the DFAT programs. They do these each year where they focus our cultural engagement with a particular country. And in 2012 it was India. And it was, as Parmesh mentioned, it was an important thing for us to be doing there because really our public diplomacy relationship with India had been really challenged in the previous years. I was really shocked actually when I got there about how much that was really a mainstream view amongst taxi drivers to the media about the negative perception of Australia. And so alongside a number of other hard power or sort of more other diplomatic strategies, DFAT decided that soft power was going to be a really important strategy in bridging some of those difficulties with India. So I worked with the diplomatic staff and we essentially produced a festival of Australian culture which lasted for 4 months across 18 cities in India with over 150 events. So it was quite a large-scale undertaking. But it was very specifically about talking to young India. I think anybody who knows anything about India knows the importance of the young Indian population. It's not only staggering in numbers, but it's also incredibly diverse, vibrant, pushing forward with so many fascinating ideas and areas. So this was really important for us to speak to a young Indian audience, and that's not necessarily what, I guess, large-scale cultural diplomacy initiatives usually do. So we really set about, within that framework of thinking about how could we approach this quite differently to, I guess, the way cultural diplomacy initiatives usually work. The punchline of MasterChef is a great example of the fact that sometimes, I think it was the Times of India described MasterChef as the greatest public diplomacy the Australian government never did in India. It's true. We actually had to employ the Prime Minister's ex-bodyguard to be with Gary and George 24/7 whilst they were travelling in India. They are that popular. It is unbelievable. But I think it also, it's the biggest rating show on Indian satellite television, but it also tells some really subtle messages about Australia that it's really difficult for a government to just say. Things like, Australia is diverse, Australia is young, Australia is non-hierarchical, we are interested in the rest of the world, all these things which sort of things like television programs can actually tell us. So we, aside from appointing Gary and George as some of our ambassadors and sort of parading them through India in all sorts of ways, we also looked at how we could make a festival that really conveyed some of those messages of Australia being young, diverse, interesting, unusual. We had a huge opening night at a 15th century Mughal tomb in Delhi, which we wrapped with 3D projection by the guys that do Vivid Sydney projections. We presented Gurumul Yunupingu, who's an amazing Indigenous artist, at that concert in a double bill with an Indian, Anushka Shankar, an Indian young Indian musician. So again, we were trying to think about those messages and ways that we could present Australia as, really innovative and young. We brought a whole bunch of contemporary music bands from Australia and toured them to some really fantastic young Indian festivals. They had an amazing time. Godrej finished his Asian tour with us at the end of the festival. We brought comedians from the Melbourne Comedy Festival, the Melbourne Comedy Festival Roadshow. I think it was a really great example of what you said of being at the margins. Comedians, their whole, the way they exist is that they push the boundaries. So us involving them in a major government initiative was risky. And I have to say, at the opening night, I did think it was either going to be a massive success or I would lose my job and they would never let anyone from the arts have anything to do with them ever again. But it was a huge success, and I think because comedians talk about what it is to be young and what it is to be engaged in a contemporary culture, and that is what cultural diplomacy is. And we also commissioned some very large-scale collaborations with Indian and Australian artists, and we really tried to think about what was going to resonate back in Australia from a cultural point of view, as well as what was going to be interesting to Indian audiences. I think we certainly did, and I think that hopefully DFAT have also learnt some interesting things through that process, picking up a lot on what Katelijn and Parmesh have said. For us, working in partnership with non-state actors, as you call them, non-government partners, creative industry partners, the commercial, music or other cultural sectors was by far more effective than any kind of Indian government institutional relationships. To be honest, we actually tried in most cases to keep away from Indian government institutions as much as we could, because we felt that if we really wanted to express contemporary Australian culture to a contemporary and young Indian audience, that was not the way to go, was through the kind of traditional Indian institutions. And we just found those relationships were more effective, they were more vibrant, they were more interesting, and they also just worked. They logistically worked, as opposed to dealing with Indian government. I think we learnt a lot about what I almost call the new frontiers of diplomacy. The idea of putting large-scale ballet companies or orchestras, on planes into particularly markets like Southeast Asia. I think we've moved on from that, and we really looked at new areas of diplomacy like food. MasterChef being a really important one. Contemporary music, comedy. I think areas like fashion and design are really important areas in the future for cultural diplomacy, because again they kind of tell a different message about Australia, but they also make a genuine connection in this environment where we're all connected anyway, essentially. I think the example or the way that DFAT actually worked very much in partnership with the arts sector, through me as a producer and then through, I guess, my networks and contacts, was, I hope, the very effective way. I think often in Australia our arts industry is a little bit siloed away from what we call cultural diplomacy or those kind of policy decisions, and it's often hard to kind of bridge those gaps. But actually, of course, we know great art makes great cultural diplomacy, and you can't always expect people working in, diplomats or people working within embassies to have the skills that you need to really facilitate great art in foreign environments. So I think that was an example of working really in partnership with the arts sector. And then I also think that the idea of reciprocity, as you spoke about a little bit, or mutuality, is something that we tried to do within the festival program, but I think is something that is really important more broadly in cultural diplomacy, and is where we suffer sometimes because we don't have an ongoing overseas cultural body that can enable us to have long-term engagement with artists and with regions. I think it's fantastic for us to project ourselves and our contemporary culture into the world, but we also need to be interested, and we need to see contemporary Asian cultures here in Australia. I think, it happens artist to artist, but I think the major lack that most of our festivals, major arts institutions have in actually showing contemporary Asian work is a real deficit to us, and it's a real problem when we're trying to do cultural diplomacy overseas, because it needs to be a two-way conversation. Otherwise the conversation's frankly pretty short. I think some of the things we're doing, something like the ATP, Asia Pacific Triennial, Doug has had an amazing effect, not just for our understanding of Asia, but also for our cultural diplomacy, into the region, when it shows that you actually are genuinely interested in the messages coming back. And I think that's something really important, and we need to see more of. I think the final thing that we learnt when we did, I guess, to the limited capacity that we could within the embassy context, was the importance of digital exchange, e-diplomacy, for want of a better word. Again, if it's not out there and people don't know about it, there's no point in doing cultural diplomacy. And I think Ozzfest, was the first time DFAT had ever had a Facebook page for one of the embassies. Maybe it was the second time. That's kind of e-diplomacy 101, I think. Places like America have 150, 200 people employed in an e-diplomacy department, looking at really interesting, sophisticated ways to make digital exchanges and to, use social media and all of the kind of really interesting forms around that. So I think that's something that we tried a little bit, but I think absolutely has to be looked at more seriously and in a really creative way going forward. So yeah, I think that's probably my few thoughts at the moment.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much for that. We have a final speaker, Rei Maeda, and from Japan. A very warm welcome. I have to say that while Tony Abbott may have received a lukewarm reception in terms of broader Asian diplomacy for describing Japan as our best friend in Asia, I unashamedly tell people that's the country I visited most often in my life and the one that I most keenly get back to. It's just one of those wonderful things sometimes when particular cultures click with some idiosyncratic cognitive disorder that I might have. Works perfectly and wonderfully, and I find it exhilarating. My best friend in Asia. The Rei-san is going to talk. Is the coordinator for Art Front Gallery in Tokyo. Has published widely. Has had an extensive international relationship with, in a reciprocal sense, with Japanese and international art, including Australian Art Platform project and Australia House a couple of years ago, and a keen interest in Australian art and a good friend of Australian art. And Rei Maeda, it's a pleasure to invite you to speak.
Okay, thank you for having me today. So soft diplomacy is a big theme, but I'd like to think about that through my very concrete experiences. So, Fukutake House Asian Art Platform was launched last year on the occasion of Setouchi Triennale. The Seto Inland Sea has since ages been the womb of the Japanese archipelago, where our culture and history have been fostered, and is the place where different people moved from the Asian Pacific seas and arrived finally. Connected widely to Asia through the seas, it has formed a unique culture sphere beyond nations, and we would like to establish an Asian art platform with the aim of being connected again to Asia areas and working together with the Asian people with different backgrounds. Asia Art Platform is located in Fukuda community on the Shodoshima Island. Fukuda is a very small community of 800 residents which has suffered with depopulation, aging, and economic decline. It is sponsored by Fukutake Foundation and sponsored by Shodoshima Town. And it is designed to provide a platform of collaboration for a variety of art organizations, foundations, and non-profit organizations in Asia. And it is expected to be active not only during the triennial period, but also throughout the year. To build a more sustainable relationship, it is based on partnership with organizations instead of individual artists. For the first year, we invited 7 organizations from Hong Kong, Taiwan, Korea, Singapore, Thailand, Indonesia, and Australia. The organizations selected the artists and held a group show on a common theme at the former elementary school building. The artists and the curators stayed in the Fukuda community over a month and created works in collaboration with local people. In addition to the exhibition, we organized a food project. To open a restaurant, we invited chefs and culinary specialists recommended by the participating art organizations. They held cooking workshop with the local people who had been chosen to work as restaurant staff. The instructors introduced their region's local dishes and taught the methods, as well as created the menu incorporating the local specials and ingredients found in the area. Through this food connection, a unique interaction took place between the Fukuda and the Asian cultures. Asia Art Platform expanded the category of art from visual arts to living art, and art and food functioned as a good media and universal language to connect people to people. Our partnership with Australia was not the first in the Asian Art Platform. We have been working with Australian institutions, especially AsiaLink, in most of our major international projects. Setouchi Triennale is an international art festival with the aim of revitalizing the depopulated region. And Australia has been an important part of it since it began in 2000. It has progressively developed its relationship with that region. In 2009, as a symbol of this long-term relationship, Australia House was established, refurbishing an old back-end house into a residential exhibition space. But it was completely destroyed by the Great Earthquake in March 2011, and the new facility was built in 2012 in collaboration with the local municipality and Australian Embassy. The architect was Andrew Burns, who was selected through an international competition, whose jury-in-chief was Tadao Ando. And Australia House was awarded the Young Woodson Prize last year. There are a number of reasons we are attracted by Australia, but the first reason lies in Aboriginal art. Australian Aboriginal art is deeply attached to the memory of the land and has inspired so much to think about what art is for human beings. We have learned much from it, in particular, in order to deepen the concept of Setouchi Triennale, that is, human beings are part of nature. In 2003, we hosted the Gandana Maya Aboriginal Art Collection, Split Country in Setouchi, as a joint project of AsiaLink, Melbourne Museum, and ourselves. It is our beautiful memory that the Maya family celebrated the opening of the exhibition with local residents in a remote mountainous community. Another reason that we would like to be a partner to Australia is that Australia and Japan are similar in geopolitical terms. We coordinated an architecture exhibition project, New Trends of Architecture in Europe and Asia Pacific, from 2001 to 2011. It was initiated by a group of diplomats of EU member states as EU-Japan project. But when it was expanded to Asia, we convinced EU delegates, EU diplomats to Japan to include Australia in the membership. For this project as well, AsiaLink was our partner. The exhibition traveled to European culture capitals, and also to Melbourne, LMIT Gallery. Through our experiences in Setouchi and Setouchi, we have learned that art can be a device to discover the power of the place and explore the region. Art connects people from different places and generations and genres and helps bring about collaboration. Art is difficult like a baby. It is disobedient and not productive, but very interesting. People build connections to each other in order to protect it. These collaborated art pieces belong not only to the artists, but also to the local people. The local people regain pride in a way of life that is deeply rooted in the land and more than 1,000 years old. amidst rapid globalization and developments in modernization, art as soft power has many more functions to play and is of greater importance than ever. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Just before we open up to questions from the floor, I'm just wondering if any of the panel members, in the wake of what each of them have said, have anything further they'd like to add around the concept of soft diplomacy. I mean, I've been thinking throughout the course of this, perhaps through a formal life of the, you use the word, Cait, e-diplomacy. I mean, the extraordinary changes in the way people relate to each other, find out about things, find value in things, and that rather declarative one-night event with an opening, a photo opportunity, and a dinner afterwards, and then on to something else it's probably relevant in certain circumstances, but isn't it, given the speakers that we've heard today, isn't it more about how we give expression to the cumulative activity that represents who we are, where we travel, what we present and what we do. It's probably not one or the other, but I think it's fair to say there are probably quite dramatic changes in A, the way we give expression to things, and B, the value of things that perhaps in years ago were not given the value that they're now given. Nice to have unanimity on the panel. We have two.
I want to add some to that.
Thank you.
And also based on, I was thinking, Ray, when you were talking, and our conversation, a jet-lag conversation last night. If I can just share some of that, I think and you saying this kind of triggered that. I think the world of events are over, and what hasn't been explored fully at all, although there are efforts being made, are these engagements, like, Ray, when you spoke about people coming, cooking together and having that exchange. So I think this workshop model is something that we could really explore, and something that Australia could be an interesting space to explore it in. I was just reminded of some years ago, I was invited by the Berg Communication Institute in Stockholm, Sweden, to come and serve as a mentor for a graduating class in communication. And this is interesting. So this is Stockholm, Sweden. An entire class at a communication school was given, their graduating project was to be a collaborative project on how to improve Sweden's image in the eyes of citizens of Mumbai. Not India, but Bombay, Mumbai. And so it was an interesting thing, but it was collaborative. It wasn't a presentation. They had to work. I spent time in Stockholm, but I also dealt with them over Skype. And I think what came out was so much richer, was so much more meaningful, because it came out of a long, extended, collaborative workshop experience, as opposed to say, teaching or the standard, formal things. Another point that I would really like to add is, again, reflecting on our conversation last night, is that even in terms of education, there's so much that can be done. Australia, while it's doing interesting work in sending people out, I don't think is doing interesting work in bringing people in. For example, education is an interesting thing to attract, say, foreign exchange for Australia, and it's really gone out and promoted itself very aggressively, certainly in markets like India or China, to get people to come in. But there's to be a good educational destination, you have to do more than that. You have to attract very interesting people. You have to attract the deviants, the variants, the people on the edge, including. So say, for example, this August I'll be spending some time at Yale in the United States as part of a Yale World Fellows program. Someone has endowed a program where each year they choose 15 change makers from around the world to come and spend a semester. Yale is paying for it, so it's a fully funded program. But what this means is that over the next, over the next few months at Yale, besides me, the other people in my class are a Syrian peace activist, a Pakistani human rights lawyer, a woman who has started, the leading media company in Africa, another woman who just lost the 2012 Icelandic presidential vote by a narrow margin. So for all these months, a bunch of really interesting people are going to be on the campus at a major American university, exchanging ideas not just amongst each other, but also with students, and then with the general American public at large. And America has so many initiatives like this, whether you look at the Fulbright Scholars, or whether you look at institutions doing this. I haven't heard of that many in Australia where you invite interesting scholars or interesting artists. I mean, there are artists in residencies, but I really I haven't seen those kind of experiments in universities, even to the fact that Australian universities don't really give any scholarships of any kind, full or partial, just to talented students from overseas. And I think looking at diplomacy beyond art and into whether it's in the workshop more or whether it's looking at educational, looking at these as spaces where we can have these conversations might be interesting for people in Australia.
Yeah.
Thank you. I agree, and it's nice to have that observation. We might open the floor up to questions if we could. As I said, there are 2 microphones.
I'm interested in thinking about art. I thought this comparison of art to a baby was an interesting one. Because the art that seems to be assumed here is a very sympathetic art that is promotional, that is diplomatic in nature, right? That this is the art selected for these kinds of programs are eventually somehow doing the work of diplomacy. I'm based in New York, and there's a lot of funding right now for social practice art, which is, I think, similar in kind. In that these are projects that are funded are usually, very palatable works of art. This is, I think, one of the reasons why popular culture seems to be part of the discourse here. There's a very utilitarian way of approaching art, which flies in the face of traditions within art that are about countering the hegemonic, right? The avant-garde, the historical avant-garde, right, is all about this. So I'm just wondering, what role does the more kind of teenage art, the art at a teenager level where it's more rebellious, where does that fit into your discussions? I heard in India a little bit about the kind of deviant, you mentioned the term deviance. So what are your thoughts about where to place that, or how to support that, or if it's even possible to include that in this discussion about soft diplomacy?
I have a few, and I'll go last.
I think it's a great point to raise. I think myself working in the arts sector, it's constantly a question, how do artistic imperatives and these kind of questions come together? Questions of diplomacy and what's appropriate and these sort of things. You're always at that point of trying to work that out. I think it depends slightly. I think cultural diplomacy can actually be more than, a DFAT-funded event or something like this. I think at its best it is actually much more sophisticated. A couple of years ago I spent about a year in Indonesia, and when I was there I sort of thought, wow, the sort of areas of experimental music are really, really fascinating in Indonesia, really kind of interesting blend of almost what we would call CCD and really avant-garde experimental music. And so I'd sort of brought together a couple of other people, and we got a little bit of funding from DFAT, but also some other funding bodies, and we took a group of experimental sound artists from Australia to Indonesia, and then brought some of those Indonesian artists back. And they're really kind of at the extreme margins of, even in the music world, of what artists are doing. But that two-way exchange, connecting people whose practices resonated with each other, has continued. And in fact, there's now some of those Indonesian artists are here at the moment. There's a sort of constant back and forth now between particularly those scenes in Jogja and Melbourne, for example. And I mean, I view that very much as cultural diplomacy. They may not perceive it as such, and the artist may not, and it often flies under the radar of some of the more formal programs. But I think all of that is very much within the scope of what we should be thinking these things are. How the government intersects with that is, I think, the big question here in Australia. But, I think those things have a huge place in this sort of discussion of cultural diplomacy. I just think it's the delicacy of how it's presented and to who and within what context.
various governments at various stages take various views. This wouldn't happen in Indonesia now, but many years ago during an Asia-Pacific Triennial, when we selected a group of young artists who were seriously radical to the point of militant, and I explained to the ambassador who'd conferred with Jakarta why they were included, and he told me to calm down. He said, it's going to make us look liberal, open and tolerant. And he said, by God, they won't do it at home, but you're welcome to it. So the crafting of perhaps cynical opportunism is also one thing. It's a bit like the rise of Chinese art in the last 15 years, and Ai Weiwei, who I know quite well. They are not so much concerned about his art, they're concerned about his voice and the way in which he can reach so many. The art is just one platform, and it's really it's the voice that he gives through that to all sorts of other issues, both real and metaphorical. But they still gave him the design for the Olympic Pavilion in Beijing as well. It's very complicated, it's fascinating, and I don't pretend to understand its vastness in any all-consuming detail. Another question, please. Here's one in the front row.
I'm Margaret Xu from Taiwan. I would like to ask two questions. With the funding bodies, they usually ask for equivalent to KPI, what you get out of it, and all sort of how do you justify such actions? The second question is, on this grassroots level of a lot of NGOs' actions, it seems like I'm hearing a lot, it's more like city-to-city connections and not nation-to-nation. I think it's just a trend that the emerging and or disappearing of national lines. Would that be the one that's the most important thing that's coming out of this soft diplomacy also?
Yeah, on the city to city, I think I absolutely agree that this is, it's not either or, but it's an and, where the changes of exchanges can often be seen the most, concrete. I'm just giving you an example of ways how we work with cities in Asia. We worked with one of the people we supported on creative entrepreneurship in Bandung, who is now basically the mayor of Bandung. This is a relationship over a period of almost 10 years, where we see how could we bring that relationship further now in creating much more stronger connections between cities in Asia and in the UK, because of the fact that we can have a direct connection that, with the people in charge. And seeing what we can achieve within a clear period of time, where we can potentially easier align objectives. On the topic of KPIs and justification, I think it's a big question for anybody, in a funding agency, and I guess this also will be discussed tomorrow in the meeting on the Move with funders. Often, it's about statistics, about how many people you reach and so on, but it's not enough about stories. And I think there is a real necessity to look at different frameworks of evaluations and measurements of how, we work, we do what we do in the arts, and how we actually are accountable for that, not just to other funders or to the government, but actually to the people who are involved in it. And it's something that is starting to gain quite a lot of, I would say, debate and discussion around it. There is an initiative now in the UK, and this is also connected to Australia, called Culture Counts, and it's looking at particularly, or Culture Matters, I think, it's particularly looking at frameworks to do this. And that's for us, and we see that others, talking, for example, as the British Council with the Japan Foundation, they were also very interested in discussing this. How do we as funding organizations actually deal with that? And how do we potentially also change the narrative around those questions, which are not just about economic benefit, but also social benefit, culture benefit, well-being, and so on. It's something that is growing, and it's really gaining momentum, I would say, and where also the participation of the sector is really important in thinking about how to do this in the best way.
Thank you. Parmesh, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I wanted to just add to that, because coming from a corporate world, so the Godrej India Culture Lab is based at Godrej, And this is something that was even asked of us even before we started. Only here it's in business, so we used ROI, which is return on investment, which is more an MBA thing. But companies are full of MBAs. Not that that's a bad thing. Sometimes. So we had to say, we were like, what does this mean? And very validly so, because what does it mean if you live in capitalism, even amongst the arts? I think a lot of people who are in the arts tend to sit on high horses and say we're above everyone else and this has artistic relevance, so we don't want to deal with mundane things like numbers or statistics or give reasons for what we do. It has to have some sublime, ethereal, magical feeling where you're swept with waves of ecstasy, and that's meant to be. But unfortunately, in the real world, we have to deal with this, and I think people, not just artists themselves, some of them like Damien Hirst and all have become very smart with numbers, but I mean even people who are art, who are in institution building around arts need to ask that question and really to justify it. So the way we do it is that we list out a range of metrics that we believe which create impact. Some of them are numerical, some of them are qualitative, and that's completely fine. But we say that every year we will create this kind of impact and we will create this kind of influence. One interesting impact and influence area is also the media. We say we will get this kind of resonance, which means we will have so many articles written about us. We will have this kind of conversation on Twitter, etc. And there are companies that now can monetize all of this for you. So if you do Ozzfest really well and you get 50 articles written about you, there is someone...
562.
So then there'll be someone who will actually translate that, and says, this means you actually generated $5 million worth of publicity.
4.2, yes.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And you know what? You only spent $1 million, so you actually made money. Yeah. So there are people, and I urge all of you to use this, and to also do this work of translation, because whether it's the government giving money or corporations giving money, ultimately they have every right to know where their money has gone and what you've done with it. I think the second is people often fail to quantify or talk about impact, and in terms of and to measure impact afterwards. So one of the things, say for example, at our culture lab is because we're based in a corporate office or in a corporate setup, we said that one of the ways we should measure our success is how have we impacted the rest of the company. And over the past few years, we've had several examples. For example, we've changed how we hire. We now hire young employees based on their dreams, and we actually give them money to live their dreams before they come work for us, which is radical in the corporate world, but it's really changed. It's really changed the way people think of a company. Is a company a place where you come to work? Is a company a place where you come to live your dreams, right? But we've created that impact on HR, and it's a justifiable, it's a significant impact, and we've said we've changed the culture of this company. Likewise, I'm saying wherever your organization is based, there must be things that you can use. I would just urge you not to be shy about using them, if you're in even qualitative measurement, to think about numbers and to think about the quantitative, because it's important.
Thank you. I can assure you, artists in Australia like money too. Yeah. That's good. Is there any further questions? One down on the back left-hand side, right-hand side for you.
Doug, can I add? So you mentioned the lady mentioned the city-to-city connection, and I completely agree. But now in Echigotsumaru, we are now trying to build up the community-to-community relationship. In fact, we have another residential program called East Asia Art Village. And the Eastern Asian artists stay and work together with local residents. And through that project, 2 Taiwanese communities had an agreement with a sister community agreement with Echigotsumaru's communities. And so we hope, our Australian house is also located in a very small community, but we hope that if they could have some relation, some connection with an Aboriginal community in Australia in the future, it would be nice. Yeah.
Yes. Hello. Can I have it? No, it's right. Hi. I come from Hungary. My name is Anna Lengyel. run an independent theatre over there. But in the past 5 years, I've been very lucky to work several times here in Australia at the Sydney Theatre Company, and was part of 2 major productions which were very successful. And I believe that there is a tendency now, I used to know absolutely nothing of Australian theatre, even though I'm very well versed in other international theatres, and the interest is there, but it was just too far away. And I don't know, you just don't, commute to Australia. And I think this is a tendency. There are more European and I'm sure American artists as well, at least in the theatre world. And I haven't been able to find a single organization and I'm not just talking about, money or grants, although that is a very important point, but I think if at this point we were to found an organization, say for European, Australian co-productions or collaborations, I think it would just attract all these donors and all these, because also you must remember you have all these immigrants from all these countries. So for instance, in Sydney, there is an extremely large and strong Hungarian community. This is the only place outside of Europe where when I say I come from Hungary, people don't start asking where the hell that is. Everyone knows where Hungary is in Sydney. It's a very good feeling. Anyway, so I would really, as concrete as I can be, I would love to, if it's not too much to dream of, even in these few days, I think we could just really sow the seeds of some such organization, and I think it would make all of us, all of our work much easier, and collaborations that we are thinking of, those of us who have experience on both continents, or even on the third American or on the Asian, whatever. I mean, there should be different ones. Okay. I think this would be very, very helpful. Thank you.
Okay, in the words of the famous, we'll take that as a comment. Mm-hmm. If there are no more questions, we might close proceedings, thank our speakers, and we'll join you downstairs in the bar. And would you join me in thanking them?